I'll wait until
Now I have.
Okay. Greetings, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome Professor Fenda Akiwumi to our seminar this week. I have known Fenda for many years. She's an eminent environmental geographer based at the University of South Florida in Tampa. And she also directs now the Institute on Black Life at the university. Fenda is originally from Sierra Leone. Part of her family are from Sierra Leone, part are from the US, but she has spent time in the UK where she did her bachelor's degree in geosciences from University of Manchester. And then she has a master's as well in earth science from University of London. And then she moved to the US for her PhD at Texas State University in San Marcos. And subsequently has been at the University of South Florida in Tampa, where she has built her career, and she's an eclectic scholar who works on a range of topics around the extractive industries and development, the anthropology of colonialism and its impact. And most recently, she has been also very much involved in promoting diversity and inclusion within earth sciences. And I just saw that in Nature Communications, Earth and Environment, she and a group of her colleagues had a paper which had some great ideas on that. And she may want to mention that paper, and I'll try to put that in the chat for others because I think that's relevant across the board for our college. So thank you, Fenda, for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. And as I was telling the group earlier, that you and I go back a long way. And first time I came across your book that you did with Kieran on Indigenous people and mining. And that was one of my inspirations to take the path that I have been following all these years. So the topic today, this title actually is actually a title of a manuscript. It's actually in the second phase of review with the Anthem Advances in African Cultural Studies. And it's really just trying to put together all these ideas and that I've been working on for many, many years in various forms. It's very kind of interdisciplinary. It's about mining, it's about culture, it's about power relations, it's about environmental degradation, it's about gender dynamics. I tried to see how I could just weave all of these different facets that I've been working on in one form or another over many, many years. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the manuscript. Obviously, I don't have time to tell you everything about it, but at any rate, this is a title: Strangers, Aliens, Spirits, Culture, and Sierra Leone Mining Conflicts. So I'll tell you about the manuscript in general first before I talk about what I will focus on today. But what I do in this manuscript is I've conceptualized a sort of unidirectional African mineral commodity chain model. And I use the world system notions of commodity chains because I'm not an economic geographer. I don't do great statistics, but the world systems commodity chain model lends itself to using qualitative data. It was devised by sociologists. And so I could really relate to that. And what I like about it is that some world system scholars like Wilma Dunaway have focused on cultural dimensions of commodity chains. So it's not all about the economics. And she talks about cultural disruption, cultural alienation, resistance, hybridity, cultural evolution, and cultural assimilation in her conceptualization of these commodity chains. And what I try to do is use that as sort of my theoretical framework, but I also integrate the centuries-old African customary landlord-stranger institution or paradigm within the model. And we'll talk more about what that is, the landlord-stranger institution is all about with respect to land governance. And then in the manuscript also, I try to show how cultural conflicts are embedded within these mineral commodity chains in Africa, and how that conflict influences chain processes and the participants in the chain. And I discussed the impacts of this cultural conflict on the mining sector more broadly, and of course, overall national development in Sierra Leone, because many sub-Saharan African countries, as you know, rely on the mineral industry to generate revenue and to develop. And so that's a major challenge we face. So that's an important part of this manuscript. And of course, in doing that, we've talked about the implications for realistic and effective policies and laws that are really meaningful, that are equitable, and that really consider all the different dimensions that we have to consider when we think about mining and extraction and so on. And then hopefully at the end of all this, I can actually theorize the cultural dimensions of this chain as unequal cultural exchange or culturally unequal exchange, in the same way we talk about economic unequal exchange and more recently ecological unequal exchange. So what I'll do today is talk a little bit about the theory, the world system commodity chain, and the way I see it in this work. I'll talk a little bit about the landlord-stranger paradigm, then I'll talk about the conceptual model that I've built, and also how this conceptualization can frame important research questions that we need to be asking about mineral extraction and development, and also data gathering, and of course, analysis, primarily qualitative methods of what I use in this work. And I'll use one example of artisanal mining as a historic customary livelihood, because we know all the challenges involved in artisanal mining and the difficulty all across the world to find meaningful policies and solutions to include indigenous people in artisanal mining, more equity in artisanal mining, trying to balance competition between artisanal mining and mining by large-scale corporations and so on. And so that is going to be an important part of this work. And of course, customary livelihoods aren't just standalone things. They relate to sacred spaces, they relate to community cohesion, cultural sustainability, environmental integrity, and of course, conflict. We know conflict is a big part of the mining environment. So in world systems, when we talk about commodity chains, like with most other commodity chains, we're talking about networks for the extraction of resources and production and distribution processes that link labor in remote peripheral places to global markets where the resources are needed. And the incorporation process into the global economy results in cheap labor exploitation, periphery household reorganization, unpaid labor of women and children who work to supplement low-wage households, and of course, competition with external interests for resources. So the incorporation process, according to Immanuel Wallerstein, who's the father of world systems theories, is that it's characterized by endless accumulation through economic growth and maximization of profits. He talks about a capitalist civilizational project being associated with incorporation into the global system. The commodification of everything. Everything is marketable, everything has a price, everything can be thought of in economic terms. The geographical expansion to widen and deepen surplus extraction, more and more exploration for resources in the deep ocean, in the coastal environments, in the Arctic, and so on and so forth. And ecological imperialism and homogenization are part of this incorporation process. And of course, the piece that I'm really interested in, that I wanted to talk about, that I talk about in the manuscript, is universalization of culture and knowledge production. That there should only be one way of thinking about how we extract resources, how we use resources, mineral resources, and at the expense of other ways of thinking and knowing and doing. So in world systems theory, they talk about unequal economic exchange. That was the foundation of world systems theory, when people like Samir Amin in 1976 wrote in this area, Wallerstein himself. It was largely about the economics. So when they were talked about unequal economic exchange between richer core countries and peripheral countries, it was the amount of labor time under low wage conditions invested by workers in a peripheral or developing country to produce these commodities traded between countries in the periphery and core developed countries. And then some researchers built on that later on and said, well, you know, it's not just only unequal economic exchange involved here, there's also an ecological unequal exchange, because the environment in these peripheral places suffer the consequences of this incorporation process in extracting resources to ship to richer countries and so on. You're undermining not only the development of the periphery economically, but you're also impacting the environment. And that loss of ecological resources and the associated livelihoods associated with these ecological resources. And then, of course, the environmental deterioration are also important things to consider when we talk about unequal activity between core and periphery. And then people like Wilma Dunaway and Chase Dunn, they say, well, you know, there are cultural impacts too. It's not just economics and it's not just ecological. And they, in fact, maintain that cultural disruption or cultural alienation from long established ways of life is probably the most dire impact of incorporation. And it can lead to cultural resistance that manifests itself in the form of indigenism, people clinging more to their ethnicity, to their rights, land rights, and so on and so forth. And they argue that because of this resistance, the incorporation process is never complete, and it's always subject to resistance. And even the local households where the wage labor comes from, where the women and the children do unpaid work, we can think of them as arenas that transmit culture and ethnic heritage, but they're also units that support and or organize anti-systemic resistance. You know, there's not only one way to think about how land should be used. There's not only one way to do mining, and so on. And of course, Dunaway believes that continuing anti-systemic and cultural resistance can actually push the world system towards crisis, leading to systemic change. And I know that's a conversation that many sociologists of world systems researchers in world systems have had, but I'm not going down that road. But that is one thought process around how all this might end. So, so that's the world systems piece. So in terms of the landlord-stranger relationship or institution, some people have called it, like Brooks have called it, the landlord-stranger paradigm. But this is an age-old relationship that's of immeasurable significance and fundamental importance in West, not only West Africa, but sub-Saharan Africa more broadly. And this, it relates to traditional land governance through religio-political power associations in Sierra Leone. Some examples of those associations are Poro and Wunde and Bondo, which is a women's organization. It's landlords, members of landholding families that typically will include the leaders in these power associations. And these are the people who have ancestral or customary rights to land. And their responsibility to the communities is to host and protect community members, but also migrant strangers. Strangers being people who have no rights to land, no customary rights to land in a particular area. And strangers can be traders, they can be farmers, or they can be miners, artisanal miners. And the goal in the relationship is to allow them access to land under certain prescribed conditions that everybody understands. So we're your host, and you're coming into our community to farm, to mine, or to trade. You have to abide by the rules and regulations of our community. You have to pay tribute to our chief or our king, so that you understand what your position is relative to the landlords of the community, the indigents who have usufruct right to land in that area. And so this is a custom that's still very much alive and well in West Africa. And of course, associated with this institution the importance of sacred places. The sacred places bind the present day landholding families to their ancestors, to future generations. And sacred places can be anything from burial grounds to blacksmith shrines, to sacred forests and so on. And so the chiefs or the kings or the rulers are custodians who have to protect the land against domination by outsiders. And this management system is also applied in artisanal mining, which is a historic livelihood, subsistence livelihood in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a deep understanding of what our relationship is as people to minerals among these communities who practice the landlord-stranger relationship. Number one being that minerals don't belong to us. As human beings, they belong to spirits, jinns, genies that live underwater or live on land. And in order to have a good relationship with them as miners, you have to carry out certain rituals that are necessary for successful land-based livelihoods. Extraction and production processes like artisanal mining of gold and iron ore, and blacksmithing, of course, is a production process. And there's special sacrosanct places, sacred bushes and shrines. Like, for example, you can go to certain villages in Sierra Leone and find blacksmith shrines, because the blacksmith has to carry out certain rituals before he begins to do his work in order to be successful. And then there's a historic jula system of financing mining operations in the traditional context. And julas are people of Mandingo extract who migrate up and down the West African coast and have done so for hundreds of years. They're financiers, and they will support local miners through the tributor system. And usually what that means is that they will give them loans to either purchase whatever equipment, rudimentary equipment they might need to carry out their artisanal mining. And when they find gold, and this is mostly in the gold industry that the tributor system is important historically. And we'll talk a little bit about why, because gold is so important in the customary context. And so in the modern day context, they refer to them as supporters, doing the same thing, providing resources for miners to acquire the materials that they need to do their work, and then they'll pay the supporter in gold or in diamonds or whatever they're mining for. And of course, in the customary context about mining, it's very important to preserve the sacredness of the mining environment. And part of doing that means preventing participation by certain groups of strangers whose presence might desecrate the environment and bring in ill luck on the communities. And again, it's very important for miners and smiths to establish a good relationship with spirits. And gold, as I said earlier, is so significant in the worldview in West Central Africa. And this was a nice quote I got from Perenbaum, who wrote about early gold mining communities going back to the great empires of Mali and Songhai and so on, Ghana. And she says, the mere presence of gold was essential at the cardinal ceremonies of baptism, circumcision or excision, marriage and death, in order to tilt the balance between good and evil in the human life cycle. And gold still plays this same role in many communities today. So the example that I want to look at in terms of cultural dynamics within an African commodity chain is, as I said, artisanal mining. And I have two different sketches of commodity chains for, in both cases, diamonds. But what I want to talk about is not so much the details of the chain, but the fact that these chains will usually have, you know, a legitimate chain showing what legal mining should look like, and then an illegitimate or illicit, as the Sierra Leone government reports tend to use the term illicit rather than illegal, which is mining on the periphery, usually artisanal mining, which is illegal. So they're seen as two separate commodity chains in a sense, an illegal chain and a legitimate chain. So that's what I really want you to think about as you look at these diagrams. And in the second case, we see the same thing. In fact, in this case, they've actually separated them quite clearly. So the green is the legal and the red is the illegal chain. So I started thinking about this in the terms of culture within chains and so on. And I thought again about what world systems theory thinkers have thought about what world systems theory can do as a framework. And Jennifer Bear, she talks about the fact that, world systems commodity chains are very important because that they take a historical, sort of more macro, more holistic perspective. And so using them as a framework is useful for fine-grained understanding of impacts of commodity chains beyond unequal economic exchange. So I was like, yes, that sounds right. And she goes on to say that the next generation of commodity chain research should study more closely the factors that are external to these chains that shape their geography and configuration and strongly affect the extent to which different actors benefit from participation in them. And so I said, that's really interesting. And it reminded me of these artisanal mining chains, the way they're usually shown with the illegal or illicit mining being peripheral or outside the main commodity chain. And so in the model that I've been working on for so many years, I thought to myself, well, maybe the factors don't have to be external. Maybe the factors are actually internally embedded within the chains. And what we really have is a distorted chain, and with a configuration that showing that distortion. And of course, again, varying outcomes for actors. And so I started drawing these little circles and trying to put things in and figure out where the arrows go and so on and so forth. And then I came up with this model. And I thought, based on the literature review and everything I'd read about world systems theory, the theoretical framework and all that the problem is in the labor and extraction. When we think about African commodity chains, that's why they're not efficient. That's why they're not effective. So, and the problem is because of these two different ways of looking at mining and thinking about mining and who should mine and who has rights to mine and who does not have rights to mine and so on. And yet these two systems are going on concurrently, the illicit in inverted commas and the legal, and bumping against each other periodically and creating, unfortunately, environmental deterioration in both situations. So we'll just go through the labor and extraction piece. Once externally generated operations start and external companies are interested in extracting certain minerals from a country like Sierra Leone, then the process of labor and extraction begins. And we have in the so-called legal chain, wage labor, who are hired by companies, who are paid salaries and so on. And they work with companies who have lease areas that they have been granted through mineral laws, mineral statutes, going back to the colonial era, and today in the post-colonial era also. This kind of mining is considered to be about economic efficiency, making a profit, mining as efficiently as you can to reduce waste, to get as much of the mineral that you want out as you can, and so on. And of course, this has given rise to cultural disruption and cultural alienation. And I'm arguing a sort of cultural unequal exchange because you're taking away land that was being mined by local people, but in a different way, and saying, this is not right, you're not doing it right, it's not economically efficient, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's going on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have the sort of non-wage labor or unpaid labor of households that might be doing a little artisanal mining in the off agricultural season to supplement household income. That as a subsistence livelihood, it includes women, it includes children who would be working on the farms anyway if they were doing farming as a subsistence livelihood. So that's another whole story we could get into about child labor and so on and so forth in the mining industry. So the extraction is considered by law, by national law, to be illicit, this kind of mining. So this kind of mining is a subsistence livelihood. But that kind of mining is largely built on social relations, not economic efficiency. So the importance of gold in society and what it means to work gold. It's not about making a whole lot of money. It's not about great profit. It's about ensuring that there's gold available for these important events like baptisms and rites of passage and so on, as I mentioned earlier. Of course, environmental deterioration is also a consequence of that kind of mining, but typically not on the scale that you see with sort of large scale capital mining with bulldozers and large scale equipment. And so this conflict between the two types of mining and the constant marginalization of the subsistence livelihood part of artisanal mining has consequences, and it leads to conflict all the time. And I'm talking about not large scale conflicts like the Blood Diamond War, but just daily, everyday conflicts between companies and communities and the government over farmland being lost, over water wells being polluted, over sacred spaces being desecrated, and the list goes on and on and on. And so it leads to a sort of cultural resistance from communities about, this is our land, we have rights, you can't just come in here and take over our land under the name of the law, and so on and so forth. And the area that I'm working on now to really think through this is, okay, so there is cultural resistance, and we know that conflict is an integral part of mining, but what can we do? Where is it going? Where will this finally lead to? Dunaway had said, it would upset the whole economic system right now, maybe down the road. But I've been thinking that, okay, so this cultural resistance and conflict, it can do two things. It can either lead to even more cultural disruption, more cultural alienation. What I'm conceptualizing as cultural unequal exchange. This is the right way to do things culturally, and so on. Or it could possibly lead to some kind of cultural evolution, maybe empowerment, maybe some new development trajectories like Buen Vivir and so on that we know about in Latin America and so on. But this is where, in my mind, the problem lies when we think about commodity chains and the fact that they're not working as well as they should. I'm arguing that it's cultural, predominantly cultural, the problem, and I don't think we really pay enough attention to that cultural piece when we analyze why they're not effective policies on artisanal mining, or why artisanal mining is not successful in countries, and so on and so forth. I argue that this is the root cause. And either way, whether the minerals are extracted legally or illicitly, they end up being exported, either smuggled, but they all end up in Belgium, Antwerp, whether it's going through official government buyers and exporters, or whether it's going through illicit chains. So everything ends up in the global market, and then mineral processors have access to the materials, jewelers, consumers, manufacturers, or whatever the case might be. So this is sort of the model that's kind of guiding how I'm thinking about this manuscript. And there's so many important research questions that you can ask around that model. I've just thrown a few out here. So, does cultural conflict challenge incorporation through mineral commodity chains and consequently revenue generation? Is there enough evidence to describe illicit artisanal mining as a form of cultural resistance? Is there evidence of cultural hybridity, cultural alienation, cultural evolution? How does cultural conflict through loss of sacred spaces and livelihoods affect communities, their cohesion, their spiritual health, their cultural sustainability? And how does the Sierra Leone government address this cultural conflict in policy and law? It's there. They know it. They recognize this problem, but the power dynamics are so huge, and the need for resources is so great that it's almost like they're turning a blind eye to the reality of this cultural piece in understanding the challenges. And so of making good policy and law, the challenges of making good policy and law. And of course, the last question is, can we conceptualize this a cultural unequal exchange, or culturally unequal exchange, which is an asymmetric transfer of cultural resources, values, norms of how to mine or how to do whatever from core countries to peripheral countries. So these are some of the things questions that I address in the manuscript. And the method that I've been using, mostly archival research. I have a great collection of annual reports colonial reports from the Geological Survey and Mines Department going back to the 1920s. And they're really the foundation of the manuscript, because the British were really good at documenting things quite meticulously. And so I've been pouring through these reports and also national development plans going back to the colonial period, just to see how the mining industry has evolved since it was introduced in Sierra Leone in the early 1920s. And of course, also some desktop research using more relevant today, current reports from the UN, from the World Bank, mining company reports, various papers and research studies on the mining industry, mining company websites, and of course, the popular press. The popular press has a lot of very rich information on the cultural piece, where communities are trying to wrap their heads around this whole business of land being treated as a commodity, or sacred spaces being violated, or the things that really matter to communities on an everyday basis. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between how land is seen in the customary sense and how it's seen in the sort of Western modern sense, that's the legacy of colonialism. So under customary law, when communities think about land, it's the surface soil and the things found naturally under, on, or above the surface, such as minerals. And because of, as I said, iron ore mining and gold mining are historic livelihoods for many communities where these ores can be found. And of course, wild plants that provide medicines and so on, and useful trees like cash crop trees like cocoa or oil palm and so on. Basically, land cannot be alienated. It's not a commodity to be sold or leased out to a stranger, worst of all, for a long period of time. Family lands are managed by the head of the family, and that head of the family is responsible for distributing things like fruits from the fruit trees and other benefits accruing from family lands. And of course, increasingly, the colonial government began to include income from royalties and surface rent paid for operating mines on family lands. So in some ways, they were acknowledging that this land was family land, so therefore we are strangers, so we have to pay our tribute to these communities the way that would happen in the customary system. And so they do that. They include royalties and surface rent payments for mines on customary lands. And of course, but the mining law, starting with the colonial laws into the post-colonial period, actually determine the proportion that people should be given, how that should be distributed, and they stipulate all that in the various mining laws. Now, as far as state law goes, the first mineral ordinance was drawn up in 1927, and the same language more or less persists even in the active current Post-Colonial Minerals Act 2009. And basically, the law says that all rights of ownership in and control of minerals in, under, or upon any land in Sierra Leone and its continental shelf, to the Crown during colonialism, to the Republic today, notwithstanding any right of ownership or otherwise that any person may possess. So basically taking over people's lands by law. And they define land as land beneath water, the seabed, and the subsoil. And of course, in the process, the multinational corporation has become the new stranger, uninvited stranger in African communities, taking over land by law and causing environmental degradation and social change and all the things that communities are concerned about. So even in the laws that were being drawn up in the colonial period and even today, there's a real struggle with this business of cultural hybridity, this business of strangers and land rights, and how to weave that into the law. So clearly governments recognize that this is an issue, and they have struggled to see how best they can manage it, contain it, work with it, get rid of it in the way that laws and so on are drawn up. So if we look at one of the early laws that were drawn up around the same time as the Minerals Ordinance was drawn up, it's called the Protectorate Land Ordinance, 1927, basically said that anyone employed by a person engaged in any industrial undertaking, such as mining, is exempt from traditional stranger obligations to chiefs, okay? So in other words, we can bring strangers into your community, and they no longer have to be answerable to the chief that they would have to do in the customary sense, because now they're protected, so to speak, by the multinational company that they're working for by the national government who's supporting the multinational corporation. And that was made law, okay? And then also the ordinance said that basically the national law, colonial ordinances could override any customary decision-making about matters to do with land. So any native rights or customs around land disputes and so on and so forth, the chief was no longer allowed to manage these problems in a customary way, that this was now the responsibility of the provincial secretary working for the colonial and or post-colonial government and the district officer. And throughout the legislation, or as you look through all these geological and mining reports, you see that there's this constant struggle to kind of recategorize and redefine what a stranger is and who's a stranger, and how, and all of this was because strangers were impacting mining as the colonial government envisaged it, right? So there's still all this peripheral activity that was being guided by traditional ways of managing, and that was just not appropriate. And so there's been, even today, a lot of effort to try and see how best to define or deal with this stranger. It's like one of these wicked policy problems and issues. And so when you look at post-colonial policy statements, you kind of see the confusion in trying to deal with this issue. And so all kinds of terms are used now. So native versus citizen, origin was as to where people come from, what is your nationality, are you non-native, are you non-citizen, are you an indigenous citizen? So they've all kinds of terminology to kind of stay away from the term stranger. But the stranger word pops up every now and then, even in government documents, and of course in the popular press, where the majority of people understand that that is the customary way of land management in many parts of the country. You find the word term stranger and landlord being used more widely. So part of this confusion as to how to deal with this problem of artisanal mining as a traditional livelihood, this landlord-stranger relationship governing mining, and so on. One of the main things that the colonial government did was to kind of construct this narrative of illicit artisanal mining. And that was basically to limit competition with larger scale operations that were being driven by foreign mining companies, of course, working with the colonial state. And the same applies today in the post-colonial state. And so just some examples of the kind of legislation, with titles like the Aliens Expulsion Ordinance, the Aliens Control in Special Areas, the Stranger Ordinances, because what they were trying to do was to kind of equate the customary stranger with a statutory alien or undesirable in mining areas. Okay, these are people working on the margins, just trying to make a subsistence living, and so on. So this was carefully crafted, and the sort of divide about what is legitimate mining using wage labor versus illicit mining by strangers, women, children, or whatever the case might be. So the wage labor thing was more respectable, so to speak, compared to this, right? The people just trying to make a little extra money for the household. And these are some pictures from the gold and coltan. Of course, in the old days, it was mostly gold and diamonds. But of course, the challenge today now is that we have minerals like coltan and zircon with rare earth elements in it, and so on. So it's become a little bit more complicated because the artisanal mining sphere has expanded to include these really important strategic minerals that have geopolitical implications. So that's another whole story. And you see the cultural hybridity issue, even in legal artisanal mining spaces. And I put legal again in inverted commas, because really it's a gray area. So you can go to a village community-based artisanal mining site, and you will see representatives from the national government there, mines wardens, mines monitoring officers milling around. You will see financiers, the supporters, the Jula, people like those. You'll see the people who own the license for the particular area that's being mined, the lease, they hold the lease for this area. Then you'll see the chiefs or other local authorities, and they're there because they understand the things like family boundaries. They can help solve conflicts over where somebody's family property ends and where somebody else's family property begins. And it might be something like a cotton tree, right? Which may or may not survive the mining process down the road. You'll find the mine workers. These are just people just trying to make a little extra money for the day. Then all they might do is just fetch water from the river to help with the process or whatever the case might be. You have the diggers, you have the panners, you have religious leaders that people consult with for prayers and sacrifices to ensure that all this labor will not go in vain on any given day. And of course, petty traders making a little money selling food or water or cigarettes or whatever. So it's like a community affair when you go to these sites, and there's a gray area between what is legal and who's in charge versus what is not. And another interesting piece for me also when I thought about cultural hybridity as something to discuss is that, a lot of the rivers in the country are historic sacred sites, where communities that live close by the river might carry out certain festivals or rituals at the riverside on certain important days relevant to the community and so on. And so, of course, in the colonial period, when the government was giving out mining leases to all kinds of companies, they actually they closed off some of these rivers as closed areas for mining exploration and development and extraction at the expense of the local people who use these rivers in a customary way. And it's very interesting to see rivers like the Moa River that still remain sacred places, but they're also under mine leases, right? So
and just to give you the time horizon, we'd like to have 10-15 minutes for Q&A as well. So
have I gone over my time?
a little bit.
Okay,
Maybe if you can wrap up in a few minutes.
Sure, I am. I'm almost there.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I don't have my watch with me here. So yes. So yeah. So this is and the government also recognized the fact that there was a challenge to preventing illicit mining because of the way people thought about the land belonging to them, and the fact that even the company officials that they hired from the local communities shared the traditional view of land ownership as the communities that they were in. And you can see this in protests where you see this people adhering to their rights to their land, saying no to companies, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so far, clearly, this cultural conflict is an inherent part of these commodity chains. It's an ongoing struggle between the landlord-stranger institution and state governance. We do see evidence of increasing indigenism and ethnification, and these cultural conflicts clearly challenge revenue generation through mineral extraction. So sorry about that, and thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you so much. It's wonderful that you are sharing this prelude to your book with us. And I think there's just so much common interest in our research agenda at the department, and especially Dr. Julie Klinger, who is leading a new NSF project on illicit mineral flows. The way you have framed the illicit versus illicit colonial narrative, I think it's going to be really helpful for the students in that project. So questions, comments? Okay, Julie. Yes.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much for that talk. And yeah, it was just wonderful to see how you tied together the theory with the deep history with the case-specific examples. I have a question that's actually about the ethnification or indigenous claims. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how people who have been displaced, maybe sometimes for more than a generation, whether you're also seeing this process of people attempting to reclaim or reassert land rights to places where maybe they weren't born or haven't lived for a long time, and how that's actually playing out.
In Sierra Leone. Yeah. That's a very interesting question, because these are very deep-seated beliefs about rights to land and ownership, right? So it might be reflected in your name, right? Or that ties you to a place. So it doesn't matter whether you were born in Dallas, Texas, right, and have never been to Sierra Leone, but at some point, if your father has chieftaincy rights to a particular place in Sierra Leone, you have the right to go there and make yourself be known and claim your rights, because that's just how important it is to people, and that's how that's what it means. People understand that, that your ancestors, were the first people to clear a plot in this area and found this settlement, right? Or your great-great-grandfather was a famous hunter who first shot an elephant in whatever the criteria for giving you the right to be a founder of a village or a community is very, very important. So yeah.
Thank you.
Great. And we have a related question in the chat about the chiefs, like how are they held accountable within the cultural tradition? Because there is this fear that, power corrupts. So one of our doctoral students from Pakistan is asking that.
Absolutely. The chiefs are in a sort of like caught between the devil. I would say a rock and a hard place, but that would be corny. But, they really are, because, they're expected to be holders of tradition, but at the same time, their rights are constantly being eroded by the very government. And so they have been subject to everything from co-optation to forced complicity. And of course, as you say, human nature being what it is, what's happening is that you see the landlord-stranger notion of tribute to the chief evolving into not cola nuts anymore, but Mercedes-Benz, right? And so the chiefs are arguing, well, it's the landlord-stranger relationship. It's my tribute, right? And many people in the community accept that. Because they think that chiefs should deserve to be treated with the respect that they typically are treated with. But then at the same time, many of them feel disgruntled because they don't seem to be benefiting. And chiefs, for example, when the government introduced a scheme to allow people to do some artisanal mining on the periphery of lease areas, the chiefs are involved in dispersing those plots and so on. And some chiefs actually own plots, right? So again, there's this kind of gray area between the traditional and the modern approach to managing mining. Right, that's a good question. That's a big part. There's a lot about that in the manuscript. Mm-hmm.
Excellent, thank you. Other questions or comments? One question I had was with reference to your framing of artisanal mining, and especially with gold, that it was done in a way where it was more for traditional uses. Of course, now because of this whole commodification of cultures, or the co-optation of cultures through commodification, wouldn't you say that now the gold mining, though, and certainly the diamond mining, is much more for the more sort of market-based economy, and people are no longer in that. I mean, and that has led to huge environmental decline from artisanal mining, which is in some ways worse than from the industrial mining, because people have commodified it, right?
Yeah, and that it's a very interesting question, because that's a piece that I'm trying to weave into the notion of cultural evolution. Because was it like 2 or 3 days ago, I got something from WhatsApp. I don't know who sent it, and it was a protest by an artisanal miner who had come up with some kind of contraption, some technological contraption, I can't think of the right way to describe it, to help make his mining more efficient, right? And when you looked at it, it was just, it was very creative, right? It was rudimentary and so on. And he was just totally frustrated because the government had sent in some, police or whatever to clear out illicit miners in this area and so on. And they had burned this machine that clearly had cost him a whole lot of money, that was probably some ingenious creation by somebody, right? And so he was just angry and was just telling people out there that this is what our president does to poor, struggling people who are just trying to make a living. That's all I'm trying to do. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm just trying to feed my family, and it's okay for him. He lives in a big old palace, and so on and so forth. And so you still, so you see that piece in there. So there's that kind of change going on. But at the same time, with things like gold, the basic worldview about the importance of gold will always ensure that people will still try to mine gold on the margins, right? They may not have a lot, they might. I mean, gold mining is not seen as a way to make money in the same way as diamonds are. In fact, people kind of feel that if you're dishonest in your dealings in the gold industry, that could bring ill luck on you, right? Because of everything that gold means in the society. Diamonds are a little different. I don't know about coltan. I haven't seen any documentation on the worldview around coltan, but diamonds are seen as a way to make money, but not gold so much in the artisanal, customary context.
Because it's, at least with gold, you have some predictability. With diamonds, it's so utterly unpredictable. You may get a $10 million diamond once in 5 years and nothing. I just put in the chat a link to the David Senge. I don't know if you know of, this chap at MIT.
Yes, I do.
And he's, the government has sort of recruited him back to be an innovation advisor. And I wonder what your thoughts are of him, because he's, as an MIT alum, I keep getting a lot of propaganda about how amazing he is. And he's, he's helping his home country.
Yeah.
But what is...
I don't know him personally. I mean, he comes across very, professional and so on and so forth. Of course, all politicians get criticized, so sometimes it's hard to know, what is actually true or not. But when I first heard about him, he wasn't back at home in politics yet, but he had this camp that he was running for young children who had great talent and creativity. And he sponsored, there was one particular young man who was very creative when it came to using recycled electrical materials to make all kinds of interesting things. So that was a project where people really respected him for. But I really don't know much about his role as a politician, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But, going to your point about innovation, such people should be asked to get at the grassroots innovation as well, not just the high-tech one. And it would be worth engaging with him. From what I've heard, he's quite approachable compared to most politicians.
Yes, because there is a lot of innovation going on in the artisanal mining sphere, even the women. In fact, I did a paper, we haven't published it, but a colleague of mine and I presented it at a conference in England a couple of years ago. I can't even remember the title of the paper off the top of my head, but we were talking about the kind of innovation that comes with this cultural evolution, right? So the women had special sieves that they would make locally, the sieves that they would use for like domestic purposes and so on. They would also use to pan for gold, let's say, right? To sieve the gravel or whatever the case might be. And then they realized that the size of the coltan particles were different, and that particular sieve would not work. And so they created new sieves that worked better for, extracting coltan gravel. So there is, but again, with all of our governments, they're caught between, that we all, even if you look at the African Union, and African countries, we all speak the line about the importance of recognizing culture and respecting culture and the importance of cultural diversity and other worldviews. But in reality, the markets trump all that. That is the real underlying problem. So, and many of our ministers in many African countries actually come from these communities where they grew up understanding these customary practices and so on. But it seems like they get caught between modern development versus indigenous ways of living.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we have time at the end, Fenda, where the faculty leave often, and then the graduate students can ask some questions. So
Sure.
there's one already for you. So I will bid you farewell, but let's keep in touch definitely. And then Kyle,